This contract tip covers a vendor's right to suspend performance. Now, I consider this one of the most important provisions in any vendor contract. And let me explain what the provision is and why it's so important. So this provision gives the vendor the right to stop performance if some triggering event occurs. Typically, that triggering event is the customer fails to pay the invoice. So to understand the impact of the suspension provision, let me talk about how the contract works if there is no vendor suspension provision. So in a typical contract, you would have a termination provision. And in that termination provision, it would set a standard. So let's say it would say, if either party materially breaches the contract, the other party can terminate. And typically that termination requires a cure period and then a subsequent notice of termination. So let's take a situation where a customer fails to pay. That vendor would, again, pay attention to the termination provision. If the default was material enough that it met that standard, then the vendor would send a notice of default, giving the customer a period of time to cure that non-payment. If the customer fails to cure during that period, the vendor would send a subsequent notice that was a notice of termination. And then the contract would be terminated. But this scenario requires the vendor to take some risk because the vendor has to figure out, first of all, what's the reason for the non-payment? If the vendor's failure to perform something was actually the cause of the non-payment, then that vendor's breach, determination of breach by the customer might not be right. In fact, it could have been the vendor that breached and the non-payment was justified. But even if, let's say, the customer did not have justification for not paying, the vendor has to figure out, is this breach material enough that it triggers that material default standard in the termination provision? So those are a couple qualitative things the vendor has to figure out. And if the vendor's wrong, it's wrongfully terminating the contract when it shouldn't have. So there's a lot of risk on the vendor in these situations. Now let's look at the opposite situation when the vendor has the right to suspend performance. In that case, let's say the suspension of performance is for failure to pay by the due date. In that case, the due date passes and the vendor stops working. If the customer is dependent on that contract and that vendor, the customer is suddenly stuck with no supply or performance of services on a critical function or even an important function. Now think about that. The vendor didn't have to provide written notice. The vendor didn't have to provide a cure period. The default doesn't have to be that material. It is just any failure to pay by the due date. So if you think about that situation and the allocation of risk and the allocation of power, when you have a vendor suspension provision, it's so different. And that's why, as a vendor, I always want to have this kind of provision in my contract because it gives me a lot of rights to act unilaterally without an opportunity to cure and just stop performance until I'm paid, even if it's just a small amount. And if I'm on the customer side, I always try to get these out of the contract because if I'm dependent on that service, I don't want to be suddenly facing a vendor who stops performing over a small invoice dispute. That creates a lot of risk for me and potentially disruption of my supply chain and my performance for my customers. So that's why this provision is so powerful. There are ways you can limit the power of the provision, even if you have to include it. So as a customer, I might look to narrow the types of provisions that are subject to the suspension. So for instance, a failure to pay sum that is at least X amount, or a failure to pay that's 30 days overdue, or something else. So the narrower you can make those trigger events, the better. The next thing you can do is to require notice before they suspend and to give the parties a period to cure. So you can't suspend immediately. You can give a notice to suspend, but then you have to give us, it's usually shorter than a termination provision, something like 5 days. And then think about how that would work. Let's say the vendor terminate or gives the notice and suspends. What's going to happen after a while? Let's say the vendor has suspended and it's 30 days has passed. What do? If you're a customer, you still have this contract with that vendor. They've suspended, but the contract's in place. Do you take a chance and go buy something else from another vendor? Or kind of what are your options? And so as you think about the vendor's right to suspend, think about how that right transitions into a termination right. So sometimes in some contracts, we'll have that vendor's right to suspend limited for a period of time. They can't just suspend forever. At some point, they have to terminate the contract if the customer's non-performance is material enough. So those are a lot of the reasons why I get very nervous about suspension of performance, especially when a vendor is supplying a mission critical product or service to my company. So pay attention to these provisions, take a lot of care, give them their due importance in your negotiation, and just be careful.